My presentation will outline Indonesia's successful transition from authoritarianism to democracy defined by centrist secular politics. I will argue that Indonesia's electoral system design and constitutional design, coupled with the historical development of its nationalism and its economic development record under Suharto, are important factors explaining this successful transition. The key question, however, which won't be answered definitively in this presentation, is whether Indonesia provides a replicable template for the Middle East transitioning polities. As popular uprisings swept away dictators in Egypt, Tunisia, and elsewhere, observers sought models of other turbulent democratic transitions to help understand the Middle East's path forward. Indonesia became an obvious candidate for emulation. In 1998, Indonesia transitioned into its second democratic period after 4 decades of dictatorship under Sukarno and Suharto. Suharto's sudden fall unleashed long-simmering ethnic and religious tensions that killed at least 10,000 people between 1997 and 2002. At the time, observers predicted the sprawling archipelago of somewhere around 17,000 islands was going to spiral out of control and go the way of Yugoslavia that had collapsed only a few years earlier. However, Indonesia subsequently transitioned into a remarkably stable democracy that recently completed its 4th straight free and fair election. The respected think tank Freedom House has rated Indonesia as fully free since 2007. But just as remarkable as the transition itself is the nature of the party system that has developed in this deeply divided society. Rather than ethnic and religious parties forming around conflict-prone identity groups, inclusive parties have won elections with largely centrist, policy-based appeals, while Islamist parties have moderated their rhetoric and joined governing coalitions. This counterintuitive outcome is why many observers have argued Indonesia's political transition and governing model could provide important lessons for the Middle East's newly democratizing regimes. Indeed, descriptively, Indonesia shares many similarities with countries of the Middle East. Muslims constitute approximately 90% of Indonesia's population, which matches Egypt and Syria almost exactly. There is a relatively significant religious minority of Christians, Hindus, and others that want to live free from domination. The Muslim community itself is divided doctrinally between syncretic and orthodox interpretations of the Quran, and divided tactically between democratic participation and violent rejectionism. Indonesia has also suffered European colonialism under the Dutch, and decades of secular authoritarian rule that co-opted and oppressed Islamist resistance. The key question for Indonesia's constitutional designers after Suharto's fall was how to build an electoral system and constitutional arrangement that to incentivize centrist as opposed to identity-based politics. Constitutional designers ultimately implemented a complex institutional design that successfully achieved this result. As a model, it could provide an interesting example for Middle Eastern countries. Indonesia's governing system creates what I call electoral decentralization through 3 features that effectively prohibit small particularistic parties and also compel politicians to compete for broad-based support across the country. The first is the nature of its electoral system design, the second are strict party regulations, and the third is extensive power decentralization. First, the electoral system uses candidate-centered elections in which voters select candidates as opposed to parties in multiple districts. This very basic arrangement forces a political party to play local politics across a large portion of the country in order to win control of the parliament. Coupled with party regulations and power decentralization, this creates a strong incentive for catch-all political parties that advocate centrist policies. So I'm going to walk you through Indonesia's electoral system, which has 4 core levels of government that showcase this concept of electoral decentralization. First is the lower house of the parliament, the MPR, which uses open list proportional representation, as well as a set of party regulations that force a party to pass a 3.5% threshold, and open party chapters in all provinces and a substantial portion of all districts, regencies, and municipalities. The regional council, which is the upper house of the parliament, uses single non-transferable vote, which gives voters one single vote to vote in a district that has 4 members. The presidency, which is the head of state and the head of government, is elected directly after the parliamentary vote, right, in a separate election. In order to run a candidate, a party must win 25% of the vote or have 20% of the seats in the lower house of parliament. In order for a candidate to win the presidency, he must attain an absolute majority with a runoff if necessary, and must win 20% of the vote in at least half the provinces, and this is called regional vote distribution. At the provincial level, as the 4th level, they use open list proportional representation with directly elected positions. This is an extraordinarily convoluted and complicated institutional design, probably among the most complicated in the world. But I argue that it creates strong incentives at all levels of government for catch-all politics through candidate-centered elections in multiple districts. And I want to try to walk you through how. Majoritarian presidential elections encourage catch-all appeals that target the whole electorate and exclude small extremist parties that can't win 51% of the vote. Additional nomination restrictions allow only large parties or coalitions to nominate a candidate. And regional vote distribution ensures candidates compete in diverse provinces across the entirety of the country. Open list proportional representation in the lower house gives voters the opportunity to select candidates, not just parties, which creates strong pressure for candidates to respond to local issues, which tend to revolve more strongly around service provision. Party thresholds, again, eliminate small parties, and the party headquarter laws force parties to show widespread geographic support. Single non-transferable vote in the upper house forces voters to select candidates again, which pushes candidates to cultivate local support, which tends to revolve, again, around service delivery. So in sum and in brief, the majoritarian SNTV and open list PR, coupled with these party regulations, all ensure what I call electoral decentralization, i.e. that parties must play local politics with popular candidates in as many districts as possible. This incentivizes catch-all parties that gravitate to the political center in order to win as much of the electorate as possible. So they're pushing, the electoral system itself pushes parties to be as broad-based as they can conceivably be in order to get past 51% of the vote. A case study of the Islamist party PKS, I think, showcases the strategy that is induced by the electoral system well. This party is Islamist, supports Sharia law, came onto the scene in 2004 with 7% of the vote, which might not sound like much, but the winning party had 20%. Right? So it was quite a striking result in 2004. In 2009, it stagnated with, again, about 7% of the vote under its Islamic message. It has since moderated, right, and moved distinctively to the political center, abandoning much of the Sharia law claims that it used to try to campaign on. When I met with a PKS strategist at his home outside of Jakarta, I posed the question to him of why is PKS no longer advocating Sharia law on the campaign trail? You're an Islamist party. And he said to me, there's no future in PKS beyond 10% in an election if they try to be a political party on the one hand and an Islamic movement on the other, simply because democracy has an instrument to force all parties to behave in the same way. He continued, PKS really wants to separate the party from the movement. Islam should deal with moral issues, religion in some cases, but blending these together only creates problems. You cannot go to the mosque and make poverty disappear. You can't jihad for public infrastructure. These quotes, I think, exemplify the logic of electoral decentralization. Though PKS might want to be an Islamist party, indeed that is effectively the core of their identity, the electoral arrangement forces it to play local politics, which revolve around service delivery. It simply can't go into the local districts and tell voters to vote for them because they advocate Sharia. They want to hear how they're going to make the water clean, right? How they're going to build the schools. Right? And this pushes them to the political center and away from Islamism. In addition to the electoral system, Indonesia's quasi-federal arrangement also enhances catch-all politics. In Indonesia, they call it decentralization, not federalism, because federalism is linked with Dutch colonialism and divide and rule. But it's effectively federalism. They just call it something different. Under Suharto, Indonesia was one of the most centralized countries in the world. After Suharto, it became one of the most decentralized countries in the world. Some of the reforms that have been implemented in this intervening period are making regencies and cities the focal points of provincial power, transferring administrative and financial functions to the regencies and cities, granting local parliaments control over their budgets, and introducing revenue sharing between the central and regional governments. Power decentralization moves the locus of power to the local level, where again local issues of service provision are more likely to dominate campaigns, which makes parties more likely to care about local issues. You're giving parties a political incentive to care about service delivery by decentralizing power to the local level. Indonesia also uses asymmetrical decentralization. The province of Aceh, which has had an Islamist resistance movement for a very long time, receives special rights which absolve the local parties from specific regulations. While Indonesia's electoral system design, party regulations, and power decentralization were built after Suharto's fall, the country also features several sui generis factors that aided its transition to moderate politics, and I'll just give you one of them so as not to run over time. The consolidation of Dutch colonial rule began in kind of the 19th and 20th centuries and precipitated the emergence of several strands of nationalism. As the decades progressed, Sukarno, who became the kind of father of the nation, advocated what became known as Pancasila, which became the official philosophy of independent Indonesia. Pancasila laid out 5 principles: belief in God, nationalism, humanitarianism, social justice, and democracy, effectively creating what Alfred Steppen calls the twin toleration of secularism and religion in governance. This ideology pervaded Sukarno and the Suharto regime. So when Indonesia transitioned into its current democratic period, there was an indigenous precedent for government built around the twin toleration of religion and secularism. So let me just conclude briefly that Indonesia's electoral system, party rules, and power decentralization have effectively incentivized catch-all, centrist, and moderate political parties. This model can indeed be adapted to Middle East contexts. At its heart is weakening centralized party control and empowering candidates to run local campaigns, while simultaneously forcing political parties to compete across as much of the country as possible. However, the historical grounding of secular nationalism, as well as the developmental success of the Suharto regime, which is an element I didn't get to, are contextual factors in which its governing institutions are embedded, and without which Indonesia's institutional design might in fact be less effective. Therefore, before blindly applying the Indonesia model in the Arab world, we need to first assess how this model's effectiveness will be shaped by the local historical, social, and economic conditions in the Middle East. I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A.